Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings to the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to From Far Dakota's Canyons, June 25, 1876. Now, this is in some ways a hearkening back to the Iliad. We're going to see some celebration of the heroic, especially Achilles. There is a romanticism that's in play here for Custer at the Battle of Bighorn, and obviously for us who live out here, this is a very, very difficult topic for us to talk about. And many readers today will struggle with this poem that was so celebrated in its time. It'll take us back to Prayer of Columbus for very similar reasons. Now, this is poem 16 of the 22 of From Noon to Starry Night. We're beginning to move now towards the end of the cluster, and we're going to have a number of these poems that are pretty political, and we're going to talk about kind of what's significant about that. Now, our assumption is that you've been with us at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, our playlist, and then you've been with us from the very beginning up to and including a set of introductory comments to Starry, and then we just finished with Potomac Shore. Now, our Nortons will tell us about this poem. It was first named, quote, A Death Sonnet for Custer, end quote. Published in the New York Tribune, July 10th, 1876. Whitman was actually paid $10 for this poem. The poem appeared as an intercalation in some copies of Leaves of Grass, 1876, and in its present title and position in Leaves of Grass, 1881. We have 5 manuscript notebooks where notes and trial phrases show Custer's death in the Sioux Massacre on the banks of the Little Bighorn as inspiring heroism in a slack time, an idea the poet phrases in his 4th stanza. And there is a manuscript, Feinberg's manuscript of the complete poem, and a manuscript draft, Berg, for the New York Tribune version. Now, again, it's a hard poem to read today, because obviously we have different opinions about Custer than, for example, would have been prevalent during his lifetime and immediately after his death. By the way, you'll remember that Dakota is used and mentioned in starting from Paumanok 1 as well as in Italian music in Dakota. And you'll remember that Canyons was used in as consequent, etc. Notice we'll begin with the word far, because we're going to romanticize what happens out here in the plains, especially for those back east and in the city. From far Dakota's canyons, lands of the wild ravine, the dusky Sioux, the lonesome stretch, the silence. By the way, Sioux's only used one time in Leaves of Grass, and it's here. Happily today, a mournful wail, happily a trumpet note for heroes. Now, you'll remember heroes from Song of Myself 18. The battle bulletin, the Indian ambuscade. This word Indian is used the one time right here. Indian ambuscade, the craft, the fatal environment. Notice how native peoples will be represented here in this poem in a very negative light, right? The cavalry companies fighting to the last in sternest heroism, back to heroes. In the midst of their little circle with their slaughtered horses for breastworks, the fall of Custer. By the way, only mention of Custer in all Leaves of Grass is here. And all his officers and men. In other words, what are we going to celebrate here? What will be perceived as heroism? The sacrifice, right? The willingness to die together. Continues yet the old, notice how he stacks the word, old legend of our race. And again, the racism of this poem, we're not going to run from it. It's obvious, right? The loftiest of life upheld by death. This is, of course, the theodicy of Homer's Iliad and obviously Virgil's Aeneid. The ancient banner. Notice we go from old to ancient. Perfectly maintained. Again, his use of the word perfect. Oh, lesson opportune. Again, this is Whitman as educator, right? Lesson opportune. Oh, how I welcome thee. Now, it is true that historians have pointed out that Custer and his slaughter came at just the right and needed time in American folklore history. This ability to mythologize what actually was happening out here in the West. Of course, it is a tragedy of all tragedies. What happened out here in the West, Buried My Heart at Wounded Knee, as a text, obviously, comes to mind. As sitting in dark days, again, this is the view of American history after the Civil War, obviously. Lone, sulky, through the time's thick murk. You'll remember the use of murk in thought in Noon to Starry Night. Murky, mystery, you'll remember. Looking in vain for light, for hope. In other words, America is always looking for its heroes in the darkness, right? From unsuspected parts, that is to say out here in the Dakotas, of fierce and momentary proof. Again, his use of the word fierce is, I think, it's fascinating to study. And then in parenthetics, the sun there at the center, and think about this being in a cluster from noon to starry night. The sun there in the center, though concealed, electric life forever in the center, in parenthetics, breaks forth a flashing light. Now, this will take us, of course, back to the Iliad, especially 18, book 18 and following. As Achilles returns to the competition and to the battle, you'll remember even that we commented on this at learnstrong.net in our full study of the Iliad, the light around his head and all of that. So we're the flash, the lightning flashing. I mean, obviously, we're playing with a very Homeric motif here. Thou of the tawny flowing hair in battle. You'll remember tawny from Thou Orb Aloft. I think he learned how to comment on hair from his study of Milton's Paradise Lost. We've commented on that elsewhere. And obviously, the use of battle here reminds us of drum taps. I erewhile saw with erect head. Now he's going to celebrate his hero here of Custer. Pressing ever in front, bearing a bright sword in thy hand. Again, taking us back to the idea of Achilles in the Iliad. Now ending well in death. Again, this is the Theodicy, right? Ending well in death, the splendid fever of thy deeds. And then in parenthetics, one more time, I bring no dirge for it or thee, I bring a glad triumphal sonnet, end quote. And again, this was part of the original title. Desperate and glorious, I in defeat, most desperate, most glorious. Again, we're back to the Theodicy. In other words, yes, it is true that Custer died and all his men were slaughtered, but it was for the good, Whitman will argue, because obviously it builds this idea of the advancement of Americans through the prairies of the West. Of course, again, we have our own view of this today, obviously. After thy many battles, in which never yielding up a gun or a color, leaving behind thee a memory sweet to soldiers, thou yieldest up thyself. Well, I mean, this is just kind of pure celebration. John Hayes, Lincoln's private secretary, loved this poem and the idea of sacrifice. Obviously, we are celebrating the notion of sacrifice. And to that degree, Noon to Starry Night will have something to do with this idea of sacrifice. And of course, the 2A message here is that Custer is the true American hero because of the great willingness, the great sacrifice. And we've seen this elsewhere, obviously, Veteran, and a number of other poems as well, right? And to be the allusion to Achilles, I think, is fairly obvious, especially in the flaming sword references of Iliad, 18 and elsewhere. And at 3A, well, I want to point out, I mentioned some other titles, Chief Joseph, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and others kinds of titles. There's been a lot of debate about Whitman and his relationship to native peoples. We commented on this in earlier lectures. Whitman in an India Bureau reminiscence, of course he worked in the Indian Bureau, he said the following, quote, talking about native peoples, there were moments as I looked at them or studied them when our own exemplification of personality, dignity, heroic presentation anyhow, as in the conventions of society or even in the accepted poems and plays, seemed sickly, puny, inferior, end quote. Now, I find that a fascinating quote because it suggests that Whitman understood the honor and respect that was necessary to native peoples. Here, it seems as if more he's wanting to be the poet of America and inventing the American mythology, as has often been called, of the idea of the hero that can do no wrong. Now, obviously, our treatment, America's treatment of the native peoples is one we've already commented on many, many times and elsewhere as well at learnstrong.net. And the tragedy of all tragedies. But here, we're looking at propaganda. Can we call it what it is? It is. It's propaganda. And we will call it that because that's exactly what Whitman intended it to be, which begs obviously the 3B question. Do you think of Custer as a hero? Are you inclined to see him as something other than that? Obviously the same question we asked about Columbus when we got to Prayer of Columbus. And what about the sacrifice of the native peoples. I mean, we think of the Trail of Tears, and obviously we have any number of evidences of this here in where we live in Wyoming and to the north, Montana, where the battlefield actually was for Custer. To what degree as well do you think that it is necessary to celebrate this kind of sacrifice, and to what degree are you made uncomfortable by this poem? Again, we're not going to run from poems like this in Leaves of Grass. I think they're necessary for us to study. Thank you.